You can't read English, can you? The sentence landed sharp and clean, like it had been rehearsed, cutting through the soft hum of conversation and the delicate clink of crystal glasses in a five-star Manhattan restaurant perched 40 floors above the city. A few heads turned, not out of shock but curiosity, the kind reserved for moments when power decides to entertain itself. Ethan Caldwell didn't lower his voice. He never did. At 38, founder and CEO of Caldwell Ventures, he was used to rooms bending around him, to silence forming when he spoke, to people laughing even when the joke wasn't funny. And tonight, as he leaned back in his tailored navy suit, one hand resting casually beside a leather folder thick with contracts worth over $200 million, he looked directly at the young woman standing beside the table, waiting, still, composed. Naomi Brooks didn't answer. Not because she didn't understand, because she understood everything. The amber light from the chandelier above caught the edge of her cheekbone, her expression unreadable, her posture steady in a pressed black uniform that blended her into the background just enough for people like Ethan to forget she existed until they needed something. Around them, the room continued its quiet performance of wealth. A jazz trio played near the bar, soft piano notes floating between low conversations about mergers, stock projections, and international expansion. A server passed by carrying a tray of aged bourbon, the scent of oak and smoke trailing behind him. Everything was polished. Everything was controlled. Except this moment. Ethan tapped the folder with 2 fingers, a faint smirk forming as he slid it across the white linen tablecloth toward her. Go ahead, he said, loud enough for the investor seated beside him to hear. Let's see if you can follow something this simple. A couple of them exchanged glances. One man chuckled under his breath. Another leaned forward slightly interested now, because this wasn't about the document. It was about the demonstration. Power liked witnesses. Naomi's eyes dropped to the folder for just a second. The cover was embossed, expensive, deliberate. Inside were pages of dense legal language, clauses, numbers, projections, all printed in tight black ink that most people pretended to understand and few actually did. She didn't reach for it yet. Instead, she let the silence stretch, just long enough for the room to notice it. Just long enough for something invisible to shift. Ethan mistook it for hesitation. He smiled wider. It's okay, he added, his tone smooth, almost generous now. Not everyone's built for this level. The words were meant to settle the matter, to define her place before she could. But Naomi finally moved. Slowly, deliberately. Her fingers touched the edge of the folder, pulling it closer, the paper whispering softly against the table as she opened it. No rus. No epaleyi. Her eyes scanned the first page, then the second, calm and focused, as if the noise of the room had faded into something distant, irrelevant. Across from her, Ethan watched with mild amusement, expecting confusion, expecting a stumble, expecting proof of what he already believed. What he didn't see, what no one in that room saw yet, was that this wasn't the beginning of her test. It was the end of his. Naomi turned the page. The soft rustle of paper sounded louder than it should have, like it had weight, like it mattered. Her eyes moved steadily left to right, line by line, not skimming, not guessing. Reading. Really reading. Around the table the energy shifted in small, almost invisible ways. One investor stopped swirling his drink. Another leaned back, watching more closely now, curiosity replacing amusement. Ethan Caldwell, however, remained relaxed, his confidence untouched, fingers steepled lightly as if this were already decided. He had seen this before. People pretending. People trying to keep up. People folding under pressure. That was how the world worked. Especially in rooms like this. Naomi reached the third page. Her expression did not change, but something in her eyes sharpened. A quiet focus tightening like a lens coming into clarity. The numbers aligned. The clauses connected. The structure revealed itself not as complexity, but as intention. She paused. Just for a second. Long enough for Ethan to notice. His smile returned, subtle, satisfied. There it is, he said softly, just loud enough for those closest to hear. That is usually the part where people get lost. A low chuckle followed from the man beside him, eager to stay aligned with power. But Naomi did not look up. She did not rush. She simply turned one more page, then another, her fingers steady, her breathing even, as if the pressure that filled the room had somehow chosen to pass around her instead of through her. Across the table, a woman in a charcoal suit narrowed her eyes, sensing something different now, something that did not match the script Ethan was trying to perform. Naomi reached the final page. The room felt quieter, though no one had asked it to be. Even the piano in the corner seemed distant now, like it belonged to another place entirely. She closed the folder gently, aligning its edges with care before resting her hand on top of it. For a moment she said nothing. And in that silence something unfamiliar crept in. Not doubt. Not hesitation. Something closer to control. Ethan tilted his head slightly, studying her now, not with dismissal, but with a flicker of curiosity he did not bother to hide. "Well?" he prompted, a hint of impatience threading through his voice. "Anything you want to share?" Naomi finally looked up. Not quickly. Not sharply. Just enough to meet his eyes. And when she did, there was no challenge in her gaze. No anger. Just clarity. "Yes," she said, her voice calm, even carrying farther than expected without ever needing to rise. A few people shifted in their seats. Ethan leaned back, crossing one leg over the other, preparing to be entertained. "Go on," he said. Naomi slid the folder a few inches forward, turning it slightly so it faced him again. "Page 4, she continued. Section 7, subsection B. Ethan's expression did not change, but his eyes flickered down instinctively, drawn by the precision of her words. Around him, others leaned in, following the direction she had just set. The revenue projection assumes a fixed exchange rate over a 12-month period, Naomi said, her tone measured, almost conversational, as if she were simply pointing out something ordinary. But the clause right above it allows for quarterly adjustments tied to international market fluctuations. A pause. Not for effect. Just long enough for the contradiction to settle. The man to Ethan's right frowned, already flipping through his own copy. Naomi continued, "Those two conditions cannot both be true at the same time." The room stilled. Not dramatically. Quietly. Like something had just clicked into place that no one had been looking for. Ethan's fingers tightened slightly against his knee. Not enough for anyone to notice. Except maybe her. Naomi rested her hands lightly against the table, her posture unchanged, her voice still steady. "If the exchange rate shifts even 3%, she added, the projected return drops by nearly $18 million. This time no one laughed. The man beside Ethan stopped moving entirely, eyes locked on the page in front of him. Across the table, the woman in the charcoal suit slowly closed her pen, her attention fully captured now. And Ethan Caldwell, the man who walked into rooms expecting control, found himself looking at the same document he had written, as if for the first time. No one spoke. Not immediately. The kind of silence that followed was not empty. It was heavy, calculating. The kind that only appears when certainty begins to crack. Ethan Caldwell did not look up right away. His eyes stayed on the page, scanning the exact lines Naomi had pointed out, his expression tightening almost imperceptibly as the contradiction unfolded in real time. Numbers that once looked clean now felt unstable. Assumptions that once felt solid now carried risk. Around him, chairs shifted softly against polished floors. One of the investors adjusted his glasses, leaning closer to his own copy, lips pressing into a thin line as he recalculated in his head. Another reached for a pen but did not write, as if unsure what to correct first. Naomi did not move. She stood exactly where she had been. Hands relaxed, posture composed, her presence no longer invisible but undeniable. She had not raised her voice. She had not tried to impress. She had simply seen what others had missed. Ethan finally leaned back, slow, controlled, placing the folder down in front of him with deliberate care. His jaw set slightly, not in anger but in recognition. He glanced up at Naomi again, this time not as background, not as interruption, but as a variable he had failed to account for. "That is a projection model," he said, his tone even measured, the confidence still there but thinner now, more precise. "It adjusts." Naomi nodded once, not disagreeing, not challenging, simply acknowledging the statement. "It adjusts," she replied calmly, "but the contract does not specify how those adjustments are reconciled across jurisdictions." Another pause. Smaller this time. Sharper. The woman in the charcoal suit flipped quickly to the clause, her brow furrowing deeper as she traced the language line by line. She is right, she said quietly, almost to herself, but loud enough for the table to hear. There is no mechanism defined here. The words landed differently than before. Not as observation, as confirmation. Ethan's fingers tapped once against the table. A subtle shift, the first sign of disruption breaking through his control. Across the room the piano continued soft and distant, but no one was listening anymore. All attention had narrowed to the space between a billionaire and a waitress. Naomi took a small breath, steady, grounded, then continued, not to push, not to win, but to complete the truth she had already begun. If the adjustment clause is triggered, she said, the liability shifts depending on which market index is referenced. But that reference is not fixed. She lightly tapped the edge of the folder. So neither side is actually protected. This time the reaction was immediate. A low murmur moved through the table, not loud but undeniable. The man who had laughed earlier now sat completely still, his expression drained of amusement, replaced by something closer to concern. Papers shifted. Eyes moved faster. The room, once comfortable in its hierarchy, began to reorganize itself in real time. Ethan exhaled slowly through his nose, his gaze returning to Naomi, holding it for a moment longer than before. There was no apology there. Not yet. But there was something else. Awareness. And beneath it something rarer. Respect forming quietly, whether he wanted it to or not. Naomi did not hold his gaze. She did not need to. Instead she stepped back half a pace, returning the space to him but not the control. Because that had already changed. And everyone in the room felt it. Even if no one dared to say it out loud. The test was over. It just was not the one he thought he was giving. The air did not return to normal. It shifted. Subtly but permanently. Conversations that once flowed easily now stalled at the edges of awareness. As if everyone in the room had become conscious of something they could not unsee. Ethan Caldwell remained still for a moment longer, his gaze resting on the document, but his attention was no longer on the numbers alone. It had moved. Recalibrated. Slowly he closed the folder, pressing it flat against the table with a measured hand. The kind of gesture that signaled control, even when control had already slipped. He looked up again, this time fully, his eyes meeting Naomi's with a clarity that had not been there before. Not dismissal. Not curiosity. Evaluation. The kind reserved for equals. Where did you learn that? He asked, his voice quieter now, stripped of performance, carrying only intention. The question did not sound like an accusation. It sounded like a recalculation. Naomi did not answer immediately. Not because she did not have an answer, but because she chose when to give it. Her eyes moved briefly across the table, taking in the faces that had once overlooked her, now waiting, watching, listening. Then she looked back at Ethan. Everywhere, she said simply. No explanation. No credentials. Just truth delivered without decoration. A faint crease appeared between Ethan's brows, not in disbelief, but in recognition of something he could not quantify. Across from him, the woman in the charcoal suit leaned forward, resting her forearms lightly on the table, her tone precise. If this clause holds as written, she said, tapping the page, this deal exposes both sides to unnecessary volatility. She glanced at Ethan. We would need to revise before proceeding. That word settled heavily. Revise. Not adjust. Not overlook. Revise. The man who had chuckled earlier cleared his throat, shifting in his seat, his confidence now searching for ground that no longer existed. Papers moved again. Pens finally touched paper. The room had changed its priority. Not image. Not hierarchy. Accuracy. Ethan leaned back slightly, his posture still composed, but his silence now carried weight. He turned the folder once more, opening it to the marked page, scanning it again, slower this time, not as the author but as the one being corrected. Naomi remained still, her presence no longer peripheral but central, though she had not stepped forward, had not claimed space, had not demanded anything. That was what made it impossible to ignore. She had not taken power. She had revealed it. A server passed quietly behind her, the faint scent of espresso drifting through the air, grounding the moment in something ordinary, something real. But nothing about this felt ordinary anymore. Ethan closed the folder again, this time with finality, his fingers resting on top of it as he exhaled slowly. Then, almost imperceptibly, he nodded once. Not to the table. Not to the investors. To her. It was small. Controlled. But it carried more meaning than anything he had said all night. Naomi acknowledged it with the slightest inclination. Of her head, not submissive, not proud, just aware. Balanced. The room watched that exchange closely because it was not loud but it was decisive. The hierarchy had not been announced. It had been rewritten. And in that quiet moment, beneath the soft glow of chandeliers and the distant echo of piano keys, everyone understood something they had not expected to learn that night. The person they had seen the least had understood the most. As the minutes ticked by, the room seemed to settle into a new rhythm. A rhythm that was no longer controlled by the billionaire at the head of the table. Ethan Caldwell sat motionless, the weight of his own thoughts pressing down on him. The folder in front of him, once a symbol of his dominance, now felt like a relic, an artifact that had been carefully scrutinized and found wanting. His mind raced, but his face betrayed nothing. Naomi Brooks, the waitress who had disrupted his carefully curated world, remained quiet. Her presence had not only shifted the course of the meeting, it had changed something deeper, something more profound. The investors around the table continued to discuss the finer points of the contract, their voices no longer filled with the sharp edge of superiority, but with the sound of a cautious recalculation. Naomi's words had opened a door that none of them had expected to walk through. As the conversation turned to potential adjustments, Ethan remained silent, his gaze drifting from one person to the next, but always returning to the woman who had, without saying much, made him question everything he thought he knew about power, about control. He looked at her again, this time with a trace of something else, something he hadn't seen before. Respect. It was subtle, buried under layers of his own pride and years of unchallenged authority. But it was there. Naomi didn't look for it. She didn't need it. But the truth was, it was the only currency left in the room that mattered. Slowly, the meeting came to a close, the room quiet but filled with the hum of new energy. Everyone was still processing, still recalibrating, their perceptions of Naomi shifting in real time. No one had expected this, least of all Ethan. When the last investor stood to leave, there was a pause, a brief moment where the tension that had held the room in place seemed to dissipate. Naomi collected the folder and stood up, her movements fluid, graceful, as though the moment had not affected her at all. But inside something had changed. She had never needed anyone's approval. She had never needed to prove herself. But tonight, she had revealed a truth that could not be ignored. As she walked toward the door, Ethan caught her eye one last time. There was a long pause. "Thank you," he said quietly, the words soft, unexpected. Naomi stopped, her hand on the door handle, and for the first time all evening she smiled, not out of humility, not out of pride, but simply because she knew, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that it had been earned. "You're welcome," she said, her voice steady, and then without another word, she stepped out into the night. The door closed softly behind her, but the ripple she left in the room would continue long after the lights dimmed and the tables were cleared. The days that followed the meeting were almost eerily quiet. Naomi Brooks returned to her life, to the small apartment in the heart of the city, to the rhythmic pulse of her daily routine that had never required the validation of rooms like the one she had left behind. She went back to her shifts, back to the service industry, back to the quiet corners of a world that often preferred to overlook her. But the silence didn't feel the same. There was a new weight to it, an energy that hummed beneath her every step. The next morning, Ethan Caldwell's assistant called. It wasn't a long conversation, just a brief request for a follow-up. Just a simple question about the contract. Naomi had expected it. She knew how these things worked. People like Ethan didn't let things go, not without revisiting, reanalyzing, recalculating. But what caught her off guard was the tone. It wasn't as commanding as before. It wasn't dripping with superiority. It was almost cautious. She agreed to meet, and 2 days later, she found herself sitting across from Ethan once again, this time in a much smaller office, away from the marble countertops and glossy boardrooms. The space was much more personal, and in that personal space Ethan looked different. His suit was still impeccable, but his posture wasn't as confident. There was something more human about him now, something that had cracked under the weight of his own arrogance. Naomi noticed it right away. It wasn't a shift she expected. Not from a man like him. "I've been thinking about our conversation," Ethan began, his voice steady, but with a certain vulnerability she hadn't heard the other night. "There's something I missed. Something I overlooked." Naomi didn't speak. She simply waited, watching as he gathered his thoughts, his gaze not meeting hers for a moment, as if he were trying to reconcile his own pride with the truth she had laid bare for him. "You were right," he continued after a brief pause. "I've been working in a bubble, making assumptions that just weren't accurate. Not about you. Not about what really matters." Naomi wasn't sure how to respond to this. The moment felt surreal, like she was seeing a different side of the man who had once looked at her with nothing but dismissal. "I want to fix this," he said, meeting her eyes at last. "I want to make sure the deal is adjusted properly, that the terms are fair. But I also want to make sure I don't just fix the paperwork. I want to fix the way I think about things, the way I approach people." The words hung in the air, raw and unrefined. It wasn't an apology, not in the traditional sense, but it was something deeper, something Naomi hadn't expected to hear from someone who had once held all the cards. She could tell it wasn't easy for him. That was the moment she realized the shift wasn't just external. It had reached him in a way she hadn't anticipated. Ethan Caldwell was no longer the man who saw people as transactions, as tools to be manipulated. He was learning that power wasn't just about having the upper hand. It was about understanding, listening, and growing. And for the first time in their interactions, Naomi saw him as a man who had the potential to change, not just in business but in his view of the world. "I'll take care of the contract," he added after a long silence, his voice quieter now, more reflective. "But I think we should keep talking. If you're open to it." Naomi considered his words carefully. She could feel the weight of the decision hanging in the air, but for the first time she felt something other than the need to be seen. She felt like someone who could choose the terms of the conversation. "We'll see," she replied simply. She didn't need to say anything more. Because sometimes the real work didn't happen in a meeting. It happened in the moments after, when the people who had been changed by a single conversation started to change the world around them. Weeks passed and the city moved on with its usual rhythm, indifferent to the subtle shifts taking place in boardrooms and the hearts of people who walked its streets. Naomi Brooks continued her work, but the quiet aftermath of that meeting with Ethan Caldwell lingered in the background of her thoughts. She hadn't expected the shift in him to be anything more than a passing moment, a fleeting acknowledgement that would fade with the next deal, the next meeting. But to her surprise it didn't fade. Ethan called again, and this time it wasn't to discuss the contract. It was to meet, to talk about something else entirely. He spoke of new ventures, new ideas, but this time his approach was different. There was no arrogance in his voice, no assumption that he had the answers before the conversation began. He was listening, really listening. They met in a small cafe, away from the corporate walls that had once separated them. It was a place Naomi frequented on her breaks, a quiet spot where the hum of the city was muted just enough to offer a moment of peace. Ethan sat across from her, his suit replaced by something more casual, yet still meticulously chosen, as if he had learned to shed the armor that once defined him. "I've been thinking about what you said," he began, his eyes meeting hers with a sincerity that was unmistakable. "About power, about how we define it, how we see it in each other. I think I misunderstood what it meant to truly lead." Naomi didn't respond immediately. She simply watched him, waiting to see if the words would hold weight. "I've spent my whole life building a career around controlling outcomes," he continued. "But I've come to realize that's not leadership. It's just manipulation. Real leadership is about understanding the people you're working with, the ones you're supposed to be leading. It's about recognizing the value they bring, not just the numbers on a balance sheet." Naomi felt a shift inside her as he spoke. She had always known that this moment, this conversation would eventually come to pass. It wasn't just about a contract. It was about understanding, about shifting the very fabric of what had defined their interactions. Ethan paused, letting his words settle, then added, "I want to work with you, Naomi. Not because you're just a waitress who knows the numbers, but because you're someone who understands what it means to connect with people, to lead with integrity." The words were simple, but they held a depth that made Naomi pause. She had spent so much of her life building walls, guarding herself against the world that had always seen her as less than. And here was this man, once so sure of his own power, offering something different, something genuine. "I don't know if I'm ready for that kind of responsibility," she replied quietly, her voice steady but unsure. "But I know this. I won't hide anymore. I won't stay in the background." Ethan leaned forward, a subtle gesture, but one that conveyed something deeper than words. "Then let's start there," he said. "We'll start with the work, with building something that matters. Together." The conversation drifted after that, but the air between them had shifted completely. It wasn't just about business anymore. It was about something more. Naomi left the cafe that day with a sense of possibility she hadn't felt before. It wasn't the promise of riches or fame that drew her in. It was the idea of real change, the kind that starts with understanding the value in people. And in that moment, Naomi realized that she wasn't just a part of the world she had been trying to break into. She was the one who could reshape it. The weeks that followed were filled with a quiet energy, the kind that creeps in unnoticed, reshaping things as it goes. Naomi Brooks had agreed to collaborate with Ethan Caldwell, but it wasn't the start of something flashy. It wasn't about public announcements or grand gestures. It was about doing the work, the real work in the background, away from the spotlight. Ethan had been true to his word. He didn't treat her like a token or a project to fix. He treated her as a partner, as someone with something to contribute beyond the usual hierarchy of business. They worked side by side, not as a billionaire CEO and a waitress, but as two people with a shared goal: to build something that mattered. The changes were subtle at first. In meetings, Ethan no longer dominated the conversation. He listened more than he spoke, allowing others to share their ideas and insights. Naomi's thoughts, once dismissed in boardrooms, were now valued, and she found herself speaking up, not just to be heard, but because she knew her voice was important. As time passed, the relationship between them evolved. It wasn't without its challenges. Old habits die hard, and there were moments when Ethan's old sense of superiority tried to surface, when Naomi could sense the familiar pull of the past, the part of him that still saw power as something to wield over others. But those moments grew fewer, and the spaces between them grew wider. Naomi was not the same woman who had walked into that first meeting. She had always known her worth, but now she didn't have to prove it to anyone. Ethan, on the other hand, had been forced to confront the truth of his own limitations. And as he did, he found himself more drawn to Naomi, not just for her intelligence, but for her resilience, her ability to see things clearly even when others refused to. One afternoon, after another long meeting in which they had worked through complex negotiations, Ethan surprised Naomi. "I've been thinking about what we've done here," he said, his voice uncharacteristically soft. "And I realize that we've built more than just a partnership. We've built a foundation. A real foundation." Naomi raised an eyebrow, not sure where he was going with this. "What do you mean?" she asked. Ethan paused, gathering his words as if they mattered more than they ever had before. "I'm not just talking about the company, Naomi. I'm talking about the way we work together. The way we've learned to trust each other, to listen, to grow. That's the kind of leadership I was missing." Naomi studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable, but in her eyes there was something like approval. She hadn't expected him to say that. Not because she didn't think he could, but because she hadn't expected him to realize it so quickly. "And I want you to know," Ethan continued, his voice steady, "that this isn't just business anymore. This is something more. Something that's going to last." Naomi didn't respond immediately. She wasn't sure what to say. She had always known she wasn't just a stepping stone for others. But hearing those words, hearing him acknowledge her not as a helper, but as an equal, was a rare moment of validation she hadn't sought, but now welcomed. "We're just getting started," she said after a long pause, her voice calm but confident. "There's a lot more to do." Ethan smiled, a rare and genuine smile that didn't come from a place of power, but from something else: respect. He nodded, and for the first time he understood what real leadership meant. It wasn't about dominance. It was about knowing when to listen, when to trust, and when to step aside and let someone else lead. Naomi was the leader in this moment, and she hadn't had to ask for it. It had come naturally, as it always did for people who knew their worth. They didn't need to demand respect. They simply earned it. And in that quiet room, with nothing but the sound of their breathing and the faint hum of the city outside, the real work began. As time passed, Naomi and Ethan continued to work side by side, building something they both believed in, something that went beyond the typical dynamics of business. Naomi's influence grew, not because she sought power, but because she had something far more valuable: clarity. Her approach to leadership was grounded in authenticity, and as the months went by, the people around her began to see the quiet strength that had always been there, waiting to be recognized. The company thrived not just financially, but in the way it began to operate, collaboratively, with respect for every voice in the room. Ethan's role shifted too. He wasn't just the CEO anymore. He was a partner, a collaborator, learning just as much from Naomi as he hoped she would learn from him. They found balance in their differences. Where Ethan once relied solely on numbers, Naomi balanced him with human insight. Where Naomi's instinct was to listen, Ethan pushed for action. Together they created a dynamic that was more than just a partnership. It was a force. One evening, after a particularly successful presentation to potential investors, Ethan sat back in his chair and looked at Naomi, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "I never thought it would turn out like this," he said, his tone reflecting a genuine sense of wonder. Naomi, who had been reviewing some of the data from the meeting, looked up at him. "Why?" she asked, her voice calm. "Because I didn't think I needed anyone else?" Ethan chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Because I didn't think someone like you would ever walk into my world and change everything without even trying." Naomi paused for a moment, taking in his words. She wasn't sure what to say. It wasn't about changing him or proving anything. It was about understanding that people could learn, grow, and adapt. And sometimes the most unexpected changes were the most impactful. "It wasn't about me changing you, Ethan," Naomi replied, her voice steady. "It was about both of us realizing that we had to change the way we looked at everything, at power, at success, at leadership. It's never been about one person holding all the answers." Ethan nodded, a thoughtful look crossing his face. "You're right. It's about finding the answers together." There was a moment of silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was a moment of understanding, of growth. "I've learned more from you than I could have ever imagined," Ethan said, his voice sincere. Naomi smiled, not out of pride but out of something deeper: appreciation. She had never expected to be in this position, never expected to be seen for more than the role she had played for so long. But now she was more than that. She was a leader in her own right. "And I've learned from you," she said, the words simple but true. "About trusting people. About knowing when to step forward, and when to let others take the lead." Their conversation turned to other topics after that, but the weight of their shared journey lingered in the air. They were not the same people who had walked into that first meeting, and neither was the company. Naomi's life had changed, not because of what others had given her, but because she had taken the opportunity to be exactly who she was meant to be: strong, capable, and respected. Ethan's life had changed, not because of Naomi alone, but because he had come to understand that true leadership wasn't about control. It was about collaboration. It was about trust. And as they moved forward side by side, they knew that whatever came next, they would face it together as equals, with the understanding that real power was never about domination. It was about mutual respect and growth.